The deceased in ancient Egypt goes through a long journey until he reaches the end of it and his fate is sealed. He enters the netherworld prepared to face the most difficult steps of all. At first, he passes by the judgment phase to know if he was innocent or guilty in his life. But that's not the end of it for the deceased. It's just the beginning, for he still has a lot of difficulties and ways that he needs to cross before he reaches the ultimate goal of that journey, which is reaching the heaven or the fields of Iaro. He has to pass through many gates, which does not only exist between the earth world and the netherworld, but some of them exist between the places of the netherworld itself and the roads that connects the areas of that world and the caves which represent hell and cuts the road in front of the deceased. Then this trip ends by arriving to the Iaro fields and the Hotep or happiness fields. These events add to the journey an exciting dramatic touch which make the reader as well as the deceased, in the eyes of the ancient Egyptian, very eager to know the fate of the deceased and how he'll overcome all these difficulties and whether he'll succeed in arriving to safety or he'll fall in any of the tricks that hinder his way. One of the important obstacles which will encounter the deceased are the gates. The deceased needs to pass through hundreds of gates, and he must know the names of these gates and their guards. After all, it shouldn't be that easy to reach the final goal, which is immortality in heaven. The deceased in the ancient Egyptian creed would encounter obstacles called gates in the netherworld. Between one gate and another, he may encounter other obstacles, and he must face them and overcome them in order to be allowed to pass. The deceased must know and recite some spells while climbing to the netherworld, so that gates might open for him, and so that his progress isn't stopped, and he might not be burnt by its destructive fire. There are many words that came in the religious texts and non-religious texts in the ancient Egyptian language and were used to point to the gates and entrances. Some of them were used within the frames of the religious texts in the books of the netherworld. One of the most important words is Sebchet, which means a door or a gate to each of the houses and palaces and temples and the sky and the kingdom of the dead. This word has appeared since the Old Kingdom and continued until the Ptolemaic period and was basically used in the religious books. The word Sebchet is derived from the verb sebech, which means to surround or besiege or contain, and takes the same ideogram of the word. That word points to a sort of the gates of the netherworld, crossed by the dead and guarded by demons. The gates of the netherworld were described with dreadful names to put fear into the hearts of those who would try to cross them. Each gate had its own special name that reflects the nature of that gate and what's in it of surprises and dangers waiting for whoever dares to come close to it or even pass through it. The gates of the netherworld in the ancient Egyptian creed had names. Amongst them is the name of the first gate in chapter 146, the master of earthquakes, the one with high walls, the master of crushing. The third gate is called the master of slaughter. The sixth is called the Master of Darkness, the one filled with screams, as well as other names that suggest what's awaiting the passerby of reward or punishment. The gates of the netherworld are diverse, and their number and shapes differed across ages. The names given by texts to these gates differed as well. The Old Kingdom referred to the gates of the netherworld, for the Pyramids texts pointed to the gate of Akhet and the eastern entrance to the sky, and mentioned the existence of 2 gates or 4 big gates of the sky. These gates were described with their having great flames and that fire surrounded them from all sides. The Coffin's texts point to the gates which the deceased need to cross, and they reach 3 gates or Sebkhut. The first gate was made of blue flames, and its fire touched whoever passes through it. The height of its fire on both sides reaches 50 arms. Thus, the deceased calls for the help of God Atum against the guard of that black gate. Then he heads towards God Osiris to save him from the guard of the second gate, which steals the souls. As for the third gate, it can be approached, for it's surrounded by fire, and that place is considered the most dangerous one. The ancient Egyptian was keen on writing down the prayers and spells that opened to him the doors of the netherworld, or helped him in going in and out across them without being endangered, in addition to his knowledge of the names of these gates and their guards. The deceased needs to tell some spells which would help him to cross to the netherworld through its different gates in ancient Egypt. One of the paragraphs of chapter 147 says, "A spell to be told at the arrival of the 7 gates, for this soul enters through this gate without being held by Osiris, for he was made to live amongst the good, kind souls. He'll be there as a master of eternity. May you enter and exist in the West." The will of the deceased wasn't confined to just entering the netherworld, but it was to be free at will there, free to move in it, and to enter and exit from it. He must answer the questions told to him by the gatekeeper, and must know some of the secrets of the netherworld and its territories and their names, so that the keeper may allow him to pass. There was a pointing to the gatekeepers of the netherworld from the Middle Kingdom era. The guard was known as Irj-Ha, and was read in a later period as 1. The number of the guards multiplied, especially in the New Kingdom era. They bore names which most probably had meanings, and the deceased must know them to be able to pass through these gates. They were pictured in different forms, the most important of which are human gods, gennies, demons, and deities of imaginative shapes. They usually carried knives or snakes, and were pictured in huge sizes, based on what the Pyramids texts described. They were distributed on the gates according to their jobs, for the chapters number 144 and 147 of the Book of the Dead describe 7 gates. Each is guarded by 3 guards. The relation between the gatekeeper and the deceased in ancient Egypt is based upon the will of the deceased to cross and the seal of his fate, for the keeper plays an important role in permitting those who were acquitted to pass through the gates and preventing the sinners. The deceased tell many spells and answer the questions of the guards to be able to cross any of the gates. One of the spells told to help the deceased to cross and confront and beat its keepers is, "May you pave the road for me, gatekeeper, the keeper of the greater gate." The deceased faced the danger of extinction if the guard closed the gates in front of him and prevented him from entering, which means to be deprived from eternity and to be exposed to the dangers of the savage beasts. The texts point out to the control of the guard regarding allowing the dead to pass and to prevent the sinners and to burn them or eat their meat. It's noticeable how the style of distributing the guards on the gates differs according to the type of the gate and the area around it. So, we see them presented by the entrance of the door and behind it and above the terraces or in the corridor in front of the gate. There were many texts talking about the crossing of the deceased to many roads in the netherworld, starting by crossing the beautiful roads of the west in the tombs of the individuals of the 5th and 6th dynasties. Perhaps the Book of the Two Ways, recorded on the coffins of the Middle Kingdom, represents the most religious book that talked about the roads of the netherworld. This book is the first attempt to photograph or picture the ancient world geographically by drawing planning maps. The ancient Egyptian considered the fields to be the heaven and his favorite place, which he hopes to dwell in when he crosses to the netherworld. He had pictured these fields in a way as close as they could be in nature, with gardens that had trees and fruits and rivers and canals and lakes. These fields were considered a goal for the deceased, which he hopes to reach, so that he may have an immortal life. The Egyptian has pictured many of these fields in the books of the netherworld, and he was pictured in them doing the traditional works inside them. There were several names of the fields of the netherworld which came in the religious texts. The fields of Iaro and Hotep were the most famous ones, besides many other names of fields that came in some texts or religious books without telling the role these fields present exactly for the deceased. The fields of Hotep and Iaro are considered amongst the most important areas which the deceased long for after his death, for the spirits of the dead enjoy a joyful immortal life. Opinions differed about whether the two names point to one place or each of them is independent from the other one. Bonnet says that the Iaro fields represent the land of the other perfect world, which the Egyptian hopes to reach, and which, according to his beliefs, represents the Hotep field. As for Frankfurt, he says that the Hotep field is just another name for the Iaro field, which is the area inhabited by the dead. Some spells pointed to both of the fields together simultaneously. That's clear in the spell saying, "The field of Iaro is flooded, the field of Hotep is filled with water." The Pyramids texts are the oldest religious books known ever. They were first recorded on the internal walls of the chambers and aisles of the pyramid of King Unas in Saqqara. Then they were continued to be recorded inside the pyramids of the kings of the 6th dynasty and their wives in southern Saqqara. The recording of these texts that were recorded for the first time in the pyramid of Unas doesn't mean that they represent the result of the religious thinking only in his time, but they actually represent the result of the religious ideology since the most ancient ages. But they were first recorded in the reign of this king Unas. The pyramid texts are not homogeneous, but they could sometimes represent ideas and visions contradicted to each other, and they are not concerned just with the deceased king, but they may sometimes point to the living king, and they differ in their details from one pyramid to another. For example, some spells that came in the texts of Unas pyramid did not come in the pyramids of the kings of the 6th dynasty and their wives. This shows a development in the Egyptian religious ideology, which means that the Egyptian thinking continued to evolve and rephrase during the time of recording these texts. Thus, the Egyptian left us new ideas that fit his time in the pyramids that belong to the end of the Old Kingdom, differing from those recorded by the beginning of the 5th dynasty. The French scientist Maspero discovered these texts between 1810 and 1880 AD in the pyramids of Wanis and Pepi I and Meri in Ra and Pepi II. The pyramid texts differed between dramatic and magical, or old mythologies and chants and prayers and spells and texts and offering rituals and others.